Our small town was a place where people never really left. They just settled deeper into the silence. The silence around my brother David had lasted 7 years, thick and cold as winter river ice. It wasn't until the stranger arrived, leaving a flickering votive candle by the old dry well, that I realized the silence was not an end, but a careful cover. The story is set in Havenwood, a quiet, isolated farming community in the temperate inland valley. The narrator, Anna, 30s, has spent the better part of a decade trying to convince herself that her younger brother, David, who vanished mysteriously one evening, simply ran away. Anna lives with the weight of her grief and the town's unspoken pity. Her emotional life is minimalist and guarded. The unexpected arrival of a single burning candle by the disused stone well behind her house introduces a sharp, immediate shock of external mystery into her heavily contained world. The morning was gray and damp, the air cool enough to hold the light mist low over the grass. It wasn't fog, just a fine, persistent moisture that clung to the edges of things. I was standing on the back porch, holding a cooling cup of tea, watching the first light define the familiar shapes of the garden. The world was usually predictable here. A steady silence. A defined border. But this morning something was wrong. My eyes snagged on a point of white, impossibly bright, against the deep muted greens and browns of the yard. It was near the old well. The well sat perhaps 20 feet from the back of the house, a monument to a forgotten time. It was a sturdy ring of mossy gray stones, capped by a heavy slab of slate that hadn't been moved in 40 years. The well had been dry for longer than that. It was just a feature of the landscape now, a circular scar in the yard where my son David used to play as a boy. He'd pretend it was a castle turret, a dragon's mouth, a secret place only he knew. My life here was meticulously controlled. Every hedge trimmed, every schedule kept. It was how I managed the chaos that always threatened to rise up from the past. Order was my shield. The unexpected was the enemy. I set the cup down on the porch railing with a quiet clink that sounded impossibly loud in the morning hush. I stepped off the porch and began to walk across the damp grass. My feet left dark, temporary prints. The mist softened the edges of the world, making the silence feel heavy. Listening. The white object resolved itself into a votive candle. Tall, cylindrical, store-bought, and utterly jarringly out of place. It was clean, unnaturally stark against the dark organic decay of the mossy stones. I approached slowly, almost hesitantly. I didn't reach out. I simply looked. The candle was lit. It was sheltered slightly by the edge of the stone curb, its small flame flickering gently in the fine morning mist, resilient against the damp air. The wick was short, having burned down perhaps an inch overnight. It wasn't an accident. It was an intentional, deliberate act. Someone had been here in the dark. Someone had chosen this fragile, beautiful light and had placed it here on my property. I felt the blood recede from my face, leaving a cold, hollow sensation in my chest. The intrusion was not violent, but it was absolute. It shattered the shield of my controlled life instantly. It felt like a violation of the most intimate kind, because the intruder hadn't simply left something, they had left something specific. A small quiet flame marking a small quiet place. Why the well? The well was meaningless to anyone but me. It wasn't on a path, it wasn't a landmark. It was David's secret place. And David had been gone for 20 years. I knelt beside the candle, the grass cold and wet against my knees. The flame was tiny, but its light was fierce, casting a miniature, dancing shadow against the damp stone. I could feel the faint warmth radiating from the wax. My breath hitched. The person who left this knew about the well. And to know about the well, they had to know about David. They had to know its specific, unique meaning in the landscape of my grief. It wasn't a random act of vandalism or a mislaid object. It was a communication. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I reached out and touched the stone beside the candle. The moss was soft, wet, and cold. But the realization that someone knew, that someone had been standing here, perhaps watching the house in the dark hours, sent a tremor of unease through my entire meticulously constructed reality. Who would do this? Why use a small, fragile light to mark a place of deep, settled memory? It was a gesture of immense tenderness, yet also an act of unnerving aggression. It was a whisper delivered in the dark, and now in the early light the whisper was burning bright. I looked down at the candle again. The wick consumed the wax with a steady, relentless hunger. It was almost a spiritual act, this quiet burning down. A vigil. Was this a marker? A memorial? Or was it an invitation? A signal that the secret I had buried so carefully in the dry, deep silence of the house, the truth of David's absence, was about to be unearthed? I didn't extinguish the flame. I couldn't. It felt too final, too much like smothering the last flicker of hope. I sat back on my heels watching the votive burn, letting the small light define the immense silence of the morning. The mist was beginning to break now, pulling back like a heavy curtain. The sun was coming. But the light I focused on was the small, fragile flame. The intrusion was complete. My life was no longer entirely mine. It was shared unknowingly, with the person who left this single white votive candle on the edge of a well that hadn't held water in 40 years, but had held all of my memory. I stood up, the cold seeping from the ground. I had to choose how to respond to this silent, burning question. To ignore it would be to deny the possibility that David's past was finally speaking. To investigate it was to shatter the peace I had fought 2 decades to maintain. I walked back to the porch. My tea was stone cold now, but the heat of the small, flickering light near the well stayed with me. A new, unsettling warmth that demanded attention. This chapter introduces a crucial witness and a piece of physical evidence that complicates the emotional gesture. I will focus on the quiet tension of the neighborly exchange and the sensory detail of the metallic residue, deepening the mystery into a specialized warning, all within the required style. I let the votive burn until the last bit of wick guttered out just before noon. The small flame had been a tiny, fierce heart beating against the quiet order of the garden. Now, only the cylinder of clean white wax remained, sitting solid and cool against the mossy stone of the well. The morning mist had burned off, leaving the world bright and stark. The intrusion felt even clearer in the harsh light. I walked the length of the road to my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins. He lived 3 houses down, positioned perfectly to observe the slow, cyclical rhythm of our small community. He was old, sharp, and almost permanently settled in his porch swing, a man who saw everything but only spoke of what he chose to. The encounter was a necessary violation of my own rule: never invite curiosity. But Mr. Jenkins was the only lens I had onto the darkness of last night. He was already on the swing, moving with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, his elbows resting on the chain. He didn't offer a greeting, just looked at me with an unnerving clarity. He knew why I was there. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jenkins," I said, leaning against the white picket fence that separated our properties. The sound of my voice felt formal, artificial. "Mornings are for watching, Anna," he replied, his voice a dry rustle, like old newspapers being turned. "Afternoons are for reckoning." I bypassed the pleasantries. "Did you notice anything unusual last night? Late? Anyone walking down the road, perhaps stopping near my well?" He didn't stop swinging. He looked past me, toward the distant, shimmering heat of the pavement. The silence stretched, heavy with his deliberate calculation. "The road was quiet," he finally murmured, looking at the distant trees. "Except for the quiet that wasn't quite quiet. You know the kind." I waited. I knew the kind of silence that feels like it's being held by force. "People who belong here don't walk late," he continued, still avoiding my gaze. "They drive or they stay home. The ones who walk late are looking for things that shouldn't be found." He finally let his gaze settle on me. It was direct, pitying, and deep with knowledge. Did they find what they were looking for, Anna? Or did they just leave a signpost? His evasiveness was, in itself, a powerful answer. He had seen something. He had seen the watcher near the well. And he had chosen to protect the watcher's anonymity, or perhaps to protect me from the knowledge. I didn't press. I merely nodded, thanking him. The gentle rhythm of his swing continued as I walked away, a silent accusation hanging in the sun-warmed air. The neighbor who sees everything had confirmed the intrusion was intentional, and that the intent was to find. I returned to the well. The small white cylinder of wax was still there. I took a small gardening trowel and carefully scooped the remaining stub into a plastic bag, trying to disturb the surface as little as possible. The wax was cool, dense. Back inside the kitchen, under the bright, unforgiving light of the counter, I began to analyze the stub. It was a standard size, the kind used for long vigils. But the top, where the wax had melted and cooled around the spent wick, held a secret. I scraped a tiny amount of the soot and cooled wax from the burned-out center, examining it under a strong lamp. The black residue wasn't pure carbon ash. There was something else mixed in. I leaned closer, running a finger over the fine, dark powder. It had a gritty texture, and when I crushed it between my fingertips, it left a faint metallic residue that shimmered slightly in the light. And then the smell. Standard devotional candles smell of beeswax, or cheap paraffin and carbon. This smelled different. Underneath the familiar scent of old fire, there was an odd, almost industrial smell. A faint trace of ozone, perhaps, or machine oil, something chemically precise and utterly inconsistent with standard prayer or devotional candles. The mystery deepened instantly. This was not a simple spiritual gesture left by a grieving friend. The residue hinted at a specific, informed warning. The person who left the candle wasn't just grieving David's memory. They were connected to a world of work, of metal and industry. A world I had worked so hard to leave behind. Who was this person? And what specialized knowledge did the residue hint at? It wasn't the gesture that mattered now. It was the science of the material. The votive was a lie. A camouflage for a message forged in a place far removed from this quiet, domestic garden. I sat at the kitchen table, the plastic bag containing the wax stub resting between my hands. The tremor of unease from the morning had solidified into a cold, hard knot of fear. The votive was an alibi. The metallic soot was the truth. It connected the quiet grief of the well David's place to the hard, precise world of industry that I associated with his father. A world I thought I had walled off forever. Mr. Jenkins's words echoed in the silence of the room. People who look for things that shouldn't be found. The flickering light was no longer an invitation to gentle memory. It was a calculated, specific warning left by someone who had crossed the line from emotion into investigation. I knew I couldn't ignore this. The candle stub, the fresh wax, and the industrial ash demanded a response. I had to identify the source of that metallic residue. I had to know which part of David's buried history had finally found its way back to my quiet doorstep. This chapter introduces crucial visual evidence that connects the emotional gesture to a specific, professional, and distant world. I will focus on the quiet analysis of the surveillance footage, the significance of the research sticker, and the emotional shift from personal grief to a large-scale, informed investigation, maintaining the required cinematic and reflective tone. The candle stub, with its unsettling metallic ash, sat on my kitchen counter demanding proof. The truth, I knew, often hides in the relentless eye of technology, even when installed for the most mundane reasons. I went to my study and pulled up the footage from the home security camera, which had been installed years ago, a simple deterrent for petty theft, never intended to capture the ghosts of the past. The interface was simple, the timestamp running like a cold, digital clock toward the pre-dawn hours. The footage was grainy, monochromatic, washing the world in shades of cold gray. It lacked the sensory weight of the real morning mist, but its clinical precision was what I needed now. I ran the playback slowly, scrubbing back and forth across the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning. For a long time, there was only the slow, silent motion of the wind in the trees and the dance of the automatic focus struggling with the ambient darkness. It was a monotonous record of a night I thought was empty. Then at 4:17 a.m. a change. The motion sensor registered movement on the edge of the screen down the street. I zoomed in, adjusting the contrast until the image stabilized into a recognizable shape. A dark, nondescript sedan was parked a block away, positioned just outside the camera's primary field of view, but close enough to be registered. It sat there for exactly 3 minutes, the engine silently idling. It was a vehicle that wanted to be forgotten. Then a slim figure, bundled in dark, unidentifiable clothing, emerged from the sedan. The figure moved with a chilling efficiency. They crossed the periphery of the frame quickly, a dark blur against the gray grass, heading directly toward the rear of my yard, toward the well. They were careful, practiced. The figure moved low, using the natural shadow cast by the neighbor's tall hedge. This was not a hesitant intruder. This was someone with a clear, single objective and a working knowledge of the landscape. The figure reached the well, lingered briefly in the deepest shadow, a dark silhouette against the barely visible ring of stone. This was the moment the candle was placed, the small flame shielded from the damp air and the camera lens. In less than a minute, the figure was retreating, moving back across the lawn, quickening their pace as they neared the street. I focused on the way the figure carried their body, deliberate, controlled, seemingly young, but with the focused purpose of someone in a professional, calculated rush. They were careful to keep their face hidden, never once glancing toward the house or the camera's general position. The figure disappeared into the dark sedan. The sedan pulled away immediately, silently, driving down the road and dissolving into the shadows of the receding night. The whole sequence, from arrival to departure, had taken under 5 minutes. I rewound the footage again, concentrating on the crucial seconds while the sedan was parked and the figure was leaving. I zoomed in tightly, pixelating the image until it was barely comprehensible, searching for any detail. And then I found it. As the car pulled away, the taillights briefly illuminated the rear bumper. For a fraction of a second, the camera captured a distinct feature: a small, faded, obscure sticker affixed near the license plate. I paused the frame. It was a stylized circular logo with faint technical lettering. I didn't recognize the name, but the symbol, a stylized atom, perhaps suggested something scientific, something academic. I ran a quick search on my computer, using the vague visual memory and key terms. Took only a minute. The logo belonged to a major, privately funded research facility specializing in material sciences and environmental tracking, located nearly 300 miles away in the Pacific Northwest. My breath hitched, a silent, painful intake of air. The simple act of lighting a votive candle in my backyard was now connected to a high-level, distant scientific institution. Why would someone connect it to a distant research center? A world of precision, data, and hard science, be lighting a vigil candle in my quiet, deeply personal backyard. The metallic residue on the wax was no longer an anomaly. It was a signature. It suggested a link between the materials studied at the lab and the object left on my lawn. I leaned back in the chair, the cool leather a grounding presence against the sudden vast expansion of the mystery. This was no longer about personal grief or a sentimental remembrance of David. This was about investigation. The person who visited the well was a professional operative, connected to a distant research center, and they were using a childhood memory to deliver a specific technical warning. I looked at the framed photograph of David on my desk. His smile was wide, open, and innocent. I had always believed his past was contained, a closed chapter. Now I saw the thread stretching not just across years, but across the entire map of the country, connected to a world of specialized knowledge. The initial feeling of a gentle, flickering memorial was entirely gone. It was replaced by the cold, sharp understanding of a calculated reconnaissance. They knew about the well. They knew about David. And they had left a calling card that was both deeply personal and intensely scientific. I printed the blurred image of the car and the sticker. The next step was obvious, terrifying, and necessary. I had to know what the research facility studied, and what they believed they could find by the well that hadn't held water in 40 years. This chapter is the crucial transition where the external threat is directly linked back to David's personal activity, transforming his memory from one of simple loss to one of active, hidden work. I will focus on the sensory details of the old notebook, the contrast between the technical drawings and the familiar setting, and the emotional realization of David's secret purpose, maintaining the reflective, cinematic style. The name of the distant research facility, now a hard, cold fact in my mind, demanded that I look where I hadn't dared to look in 20 years, in the sealed boxes of David's belongings. These were the archives of a life abruptly paused, stored in the back of the linen closet, gathering dust and silence. Opening them felt like disturbing a grave. I brought a single heavy cardboard box to the dining room table. The room was bright with morning light, which seemed only to highlight the darkness of the task. I cut the tape with a knife, the sharp, tearing sound loud and abrasive. The contents smelled faintly of old paper, childhood crayons, and the faint sweet scent of a life that never finished blooming. The box held the mundane treasures of a young man. Faded t-shirts, school trophies, a baseball glove stiff with disuse. I sifted through the familiarity, letting the small memories wash over me. The way he threw a curveball, the precise, frustrated sound he made when tackling a tough equation. I was looking for anything that might connect him, the innocent boy I remembered, to the cold, professional world of that distant research facility. My fingers brushed against something stiff, heavier than the rest. It was a college notebook, leather-bound and thick, tucked beneath a stack of old textbooks. It was his project book, the one he carried everywhere in the final months. I opened it slowly. The pages were filled not with casual class notes, but with intricate, meticulous work. David had always possessed a restless, technical mind. The notebook was a testament to that energy. The early pages were dense with familiar things: electrical diagrams, complex circuit board layouts, calculations for current flow and resistance. This was the work I knew he loved, the hard logical world of engineering. But as I turned the pages, the content took an unexpected, jarring turn. The careful diagrams gave way to drawings that were intensely localized. I recognized the hand-drawn lines immediately. They were geological maps of our immediate area. Not simple street maps, but highly detailed cross-sections and topological surveys. He had drawn contour lines, water tables, and rock strata. The maps focused intensely, almost obsessively, on subterranean water flow. He had marked drainage patterns and depth soundings. My mind raced. David wasn't working on a theoretical project. He was mapping this ground. Our ground. The place he had spent his entire childhood. And then the focus narrowed further. He had concentrated a series of detailed, hand-drawn schematics directly onto one specific point on his map. A small dark circle labeled, simply, the source. The source. I knew what that was. It was the old stone well that hadn't held water in 40 years. I looked back at the first chapter's memory, the candle flickering gently, placed right by the well's mossy stones. The stranger knew. The research facility knew. They hadn't chosen the well for sentimental reasons. They had chosen it for its technical significance. David wasn't just playing there as a boy. He was studying it as a young man. I flipped to the final page of the notebook. The meticulous detail was gone. The writing was a hurriedly scribbled note, the handwriting large and jagged, as if written in poor light or under duress. The note was short, an urgent whisper of fear and discovery. They know I found the connection. Not the surface flow. Too deep. The old well's empty mouth is the key. Tell no one. The source is not water. The words hit me with the physical force of a truth long denied. David wasn't planning to run away. He was working on something intensely technical and localized, something here. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been intercepted. The disappearance was tied to his research. David wasn't just studying the well. He had found something in the well. And whatever that something was, it was important enough to connect him to a specialized facility 300 miles away, and to bring an agent in the pre-dawn hours to light a silent, coded warning on my lawn. The votive candle was not a memorial. It was a search marker. I sat back, the smooth, worn leather of David's notebook cool in my trembling hands. The room, once bright and comforting, now felt like the center of a storm. My son was not a victim of circumstance. He was an investigator whose final, desperate discovery had put him in danger. I thought of the metallic residue on the wax, the research facility, the geological maps, the final terrified words in the notebook. The well, the dry, harmless place of childhood games, was an empty mouth guarding a significant secret. I had to know what David meant by "the source is not water." I had to know what he was working on and why someone needed that answer buried forever. I closed the notebook, carefully protecting the hurried final entry. I would not allow David's last plea, "tell no one," to be the end of the story. I had to go to the source, armed with the questions in his own hand. This chapter marks the physical confrontation with the mystery, and confirms the well's function as a hidden access point. I will focus on the sensory experience of descending into the dark, confined space and the tangible evidence of David's final effort, building tension around the iron ring and the scratches, all within the required reflective tone. The afternoon sun was high, but the light felt thin, almost artificial. I was standing over the old stone well, the brass key from the antique shop in one hand, the notebook of David's maps in the other. I had no illusions now. The well was the epicenter. The time for observation was over. It was time for descent. I had managed to shift the heavy slate cap with the help of a borrowed lever. The slab scraped against the mossy stone with a low, grinding sound that felt like the voice of the past, finally giving way. The opening was dark, a perfect, uncompromising circle leading into the earth. The air that rose from the opening was immediately cold, damp, and thick. It carried the ancient, mineral smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. It was the breath of the forgotten, the smell of deep history. I secured a strong new rope around the thickest portion of the stone curb, testing the knot twice. Lowering myself into the well felt like stepping into an old dream. The surface world, the green grass, the warm sun, the gentle routine of my life, retreated instantly. The walls pressed in, rough and cold against my shoulders. The darkness was immense, heavy. The stone structure was surprisingly deep, far deeper than I remembered from vague childhood glances. The light from the opening above quickly diminished, creating a tunnel of cold, damp shadow. I moved slowly, trusting the rope, my free hand guiding me down the rough, wet stones. The silence here was different from the silence of the house or the garden. It was a subterranean silence, a lack of air movement, a profound quiet that felt eternal, waiting. Every scrape of my boot against the stones, every shallow breath I took was magnified. I reached a point where the stones were no longer the only construction. Interspersed with the traditional, rounded well stones were massive, heavy iron rings. They were thick, rusted, and deliberately mortared into the sides, spaced perhaps 5 feet apart. They weren't handholds. They were structural, far too robust for mere support, suggesting a purpose beyond simply containing water. The well had been built not just as a cistern but as a shaft. The notebook's urgency was suddenly palpable. David hadn't been studying water tables. He had been studying access points. I continued the descent, the air growing colder, the metallic smell stronger. The shaft was unnervingly straight and true. Finally, my feet found the bottom. The ground was hard, packed earth and small stones, uneven and surprisingly dry, confirming the well's decades of disuse. I released the rope and pulled out the small, waterproof flashlight I had clipped to my jacket. The beam cut through the intense darkness, revealing the confined space. The base of the well was a small, circular basin, the stone walls continuing down slightly below my feet. I slowly circled the perimeter, directing the beam of light along the stone and mortar. My eyes settled on the lowest of the iron rings, the one nearest the basin floor. Here, the stone told a silent, clear story. Clustered around the ring in the heavy aged mortar was a series of small deep scratches. They were not random weathering marks. They were sharp, distinct gouges, concentrated and forceful, as if someone, undoubtedly David, had worked at this spot with immense, frustrated energy. The scratches suggested 2 possibilities. Either David was trying to force the ring open or detach it from the mortar, or he was using it as a deliberate, fixed anchor point for something heavy or structural. I ran my gloved hand over the scratches. They felt fresh beneath the dust, a clear, tangible testament to my son's final desperate activity. He had been here. He had been working toward a goal. The ring itself was smooth with rust, but beneath the grime, I noticed a subtle join, a slight seam where the iron met the stone. It looked less like a fixed structural support, and more like a concealed pivot point. The discovery confirmed that the well was a deliberate deception, hiding a structural element that the candlelighter, the agent from the research facility, might also know about. I stood in the cold, deep silence, surrounded by the rough stone and the heavy smell of iron. The well was not David's memory. It was David's unfinished work. What was David trying to access or hide deep within this dry basin? The answer was clearly beyond the base of the well. The iron ring, the scratches, the final scribbled note about the empty mouth of the well. It all pointed toward a deeper subterranean access. I pulled the tarnished brass key from my pocket, its surface reflecting the small beam of the flashlight. The key was small, simple, and the final piece of the navigator's riddle. It felt meant for a mechanism, a lock. I held the key up to the cold, rusted iron ring, testing the fit. The darkness pressed in, heavy and expectant. I was no longer an observer of my past. I was standing at the threshold of my son's final truth. The drive took 2 days, a long, quiet flight from the familiar landscape of Havenwood and its settled grief. 300 miles separated the silent, mossy well from the bright, unforgiving structure of the research facility. It was a place of glass and steel, clean lines, and relentless logic, the antithesis of my quiet, contained life. It smelled of ozone and polished concrete. The building itself felt like a machine, humming with unseen, calculated energy. I arrived with David's notebook tucked into my bag, the metallic residue from the candle stub sealed in a small vial. My role was simple. A nervous graduate student from a small local college, interested in geothermal applications and seeking mentorship. The deception felt thin, but it was the only way in. I navigated the labyrinth of clean, empty corridors, the sound of my own footsteps muffled by the industrial carpet. I was finally directed to the office of Mr. Vance, the engineer whose name I had found on a departmental roster, an older, established man who seemed to belong to the facility's initial foundational phase. Vance was seated behind a large, clear desk that held nothing but a screen and a cooling cup of coffee. He was precise, his movements sharp, but there was a deep underlying anxiety in the way his eyes constantly darted around the room. He was the kind of man who measured his words carefully, accustomed to guarding information. I launched into my practiced lie. My fascination with regional heat transference, my curiosity about independent valley-based power sources. He listened with polite, sterile patience, his expression unreadable. I then introduced the name. I understand a young man a few years ago, David Thomas, attempted to contact your facility regarding some localized findings. The name, spoken softly in that sterile room, produced an immediate, visceral reaction. Mr. Vance's precision faltered. His hands, which had been resting flat on the desk, curled inward slightly. He didn't look up, but the stillness of his body was louder than any shout. Thomas, he repeated, the name tasting dry in his mouth. Yes, I remember the name. He was persistent. A bit zealous. He regained his composure quickly, folding his hands on the desk. He explained that David had contacted the facility repeatedly, sending detailed geological maps, the same ones in David's notebook, along with theoretical calculations. Vance leaned back, adopting a posture of professional dismissal. He revealed the core of David's research. David claimed to have developed a clean, self-sustaining energy source based on untapped geothermal heat beneath the valley floor. He believed the old well was drilled precisely over a weak point in the strata, a natural pressure valve leading to a vast, concentrated heat source. He called it the source, Vance scoffed, a small, forced smile on his face. A marvelous theory, thermodynamically sound, but politically and logistically impossible. He believed he could pull endless, clean power from under his own house. Vance dismissed David's work as delusional, a graduate-level flight of fancy. The pressure, he claimed, was too unstable, the risk too high for a major institution to touch. I let the silence hang, watching the anxiety around his eyes. He was hiding something beneath the dismissal. David's work, whatever its risk, was groundbreaking. I pushed the critical point. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small sealed vial containing the candle stub and the telltale residue. I found this near his property, I stated, placing the vial gently on the desk. It was left by the old well, and the analysis showed an unusual metallic residue, specifically a trace component that I, as a geothermal student, can't quite identify. It has a high magnetic permeability. Mr. Vance looked at the vial. He didn't reach for it, but the guilt in his eyes was immediate and unmistakable. The controlled mask of the engineer dissolved for a single fleeting second. His eyes flickered guiltily, dropping instantly to the floor. The simple, non-technical question had bypassed his defense. I wouldn't know about that, he murmured, his voice now lower, rougher. We deal in pure compounds here. Standard materials. His denial was too swift, too absolute. I knew then. The candle lighter was connected to this facility. The metallic residue was a signature of their specialized material. David's groundbreaking, and perhaps dangerous, theory had not been dismissed. It had been stolen. I stood up, gathering my things. The cold, sterile air of the facility suddenly felt charged with hidden energy. The very energy David had claimed to harness. Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance, I said, retrieving the vial. You've given me much to think about regarding regional instability. He merely watched me leave, the tension in his rigid posture confirming my suspicion. David's work was not delusional. It was valuable enough to draw the attention of this powerful, distant corporation. His disappearance was not a flight of fancy, but an intervention. The well was the access point. The iron rings were the structure. The geothermal source was the prize. I left the research facility, the sun reflecting blindingly off the glass walls. I had the confirmation. David was working on something dangerous, and his disappearance was directly tied to the secret he found in the well. The next step was to return to that dry basin and find out what David anchored to those iron rings, and what that residue was truly made of. This chapter shifts the narrative from Anna's investigation to the stranger's active communication, demanding a decision on trust. I will focus on the sensory detail of the paper crane, the connection to David's notebook, and the emotional pivot between fear and cautious hope, maintaining the quiet, reflective style. The drive back from the research facility was a blur of highway lights and cold, hard facts. I arrived home after midnight, exhausted, but with the chilling certainty that David's disappearance was tied to a secret beneath my garden and a conspiracy 300 miles away. The silence of the house was no longer a comfort. It was a vast, heavy cover. I fell into a brief, troubled sleep, dreaming of clean steel and the nervous flicker in Mr. Vance's eyes. The following morning, I woke before the sun, drawn by an instinct that demanded I look toward the well. The air was sharp, cool, and perfectly still. The world was again draped in that pale, undecided light of pre-dawn. And there it was. Not the absence of the watcher, but a repeated, insistent presence. Beside the mossy stones of the well, where the first votive stub had rested, there was a second candle. This one was smaller, perhaps a tea light, and it was already half burnt down, suggesting it had been placed very recently, in the final darkest hour before dawn. It was another silent vigil, another marker. I walked toward it, the dew soaking my slippers. This second intrusion, coming immediately after my visit to Mr. Vance, was not a coincidence. It was a clear, direct response. Someone knew I had been to the facility. Someone was marking my progress. The candle itself was less significant than what lay beside it. Nestled against the stone, untouched by the dew, was a small, perfectly formed, hand-folded paper crane. The sight of the crane was an emotional shock that bypassed my professional fear. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a small act of artful patience. It sat there, fragile and white, carrying a weight of meaning disproportionate to its size. I knelt down, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I gently picked up the paper crane. It was cool and crisp to the touch. And then I saw the material. The crane was folded from graph paper, small faint blue lines crisscrossing its surface. The pattern, the precise shade, the weight of the paper. It was identical to the pages in David's college notebook. The notebook I had just taken out of storage. The communication was now clearly targeted and personal. The stranger was not just monitoring the well. They were in possession of a specific, intimate piece of David's life. They knew about his work, his maps, and his materials. The well was the physical lock. The graph paper was the signature of the key holder. This eliminated the possibility of a random investigator. The person behind the candle was either a close confidant of David's, a collaborator who shared his materials, or they were the very person who stole his most critical research, leaving behind a mocking, deeply informed clue. The initial fear of the watcher in the fog shifted into a complex, agonizing question of trust. I held the small paper crane, turning it slowly in the new light. Why a crane? The crane symbolized hope, healing, and by tradition the fulfillment of a wish. It was a language of empathy, juxtaposed against the cold, industrial residue of the first candle. If this was the facility's agent, why the tenderness? Why risk leaving a personalized clue that could be traced back to David? It made no sense for a professional cleanup crew to leave a sign of shared intimacy. The most likely answer began to form, trembling but persistent. The stranger was a friend trying to guide her. A collaborator who had been monitoring the site, perhaps placed there by David himself, or someone who found his final instructions and was now confirming that Anna was on the right path. I examined the crane again. There was no writing, no number. But on the reverse side of the paper, near the spine of the crane's body, I noticed a subtle detail. A small, faint indentation in the paper, pressed into the surface before it was folded. It wasn't ink. It was an intentional mark made by a tool. I carefully unfolded the delicate crane, smoothing the graph paper until the indentation was clear. It was a single, precise small circular mark, pressed deeply enough to leave a permanent depression in the paper. It looked exactly like the tip of a drill bit, or the end of a very specific technical probe. A signature of an engineer, confirming the connection to David's technical world. I refolded the crane, tucking it securely into my pocket, alongside the vial of metallic wax. The decision was made. The danger was real, but the gesture was too personal, too specific to David's quiet, technical world to ignore. The sender was risking too much to simply be a marker. They were reaching out. The second candle, small and silent, confirmed that I had to follow the paper crane's lead. It was a direct, clandestine line of communication established on my own terms, through David's memories. I returned to the house, no longer exhausted but strangely energized. I had the key to David's research, the notebook, the location, the well, and now a tenuous, hopeful connection to a partner. The next step was to find out what David's technical drawings revealed about the interior of that iron ring, and what specialized tool might leave such a precise circular mark. This chapter delivers the emotional confirmation of the collaborator, and transitions the narrative into direct investigation of their shared past. I will focus on the intimacy of the name, the cold reality of the 7-year silence, and the motivation for the extreme caution, maintaining the required reflective, cinematic tone. I carried the paper crane into the silence of my study, the faint geometric lines of the graph paper a stark contrast to the rough feel of the metallic wax stub resting nearby. The small folded paper was no longer a question, it was a name waiting to be revealed. I handled it with meticulous care, the fragility of the paper reflecting the fragility of the 7-year silence it was about to break. I sat at David's old desk, the space where he had scribbled the hurried warning about the well. I gently, slowly unfolded the paper crane, reversing the steps of its creation. The creases were sharp, deliberate, the work of someone practiced in quiet, focused labor. The crane flattened into a single sheet of graph paper. The faint circular mark, the signature of a drill bit, was now clearly visible near the center. And there, scrawled in faint, barely legible pencil, was a single word. Not a command, not a code. Just a name. Gregory. The name hit me with an intimacy that was almost painful. It wasn't the code from the votive or the remote fact of the research facility. It was a person, a friend, a memory I had long since filed under collateral damage. I immediately turned to David's old laptop, dormant for 7 years. Its screen flickered to life, sluggish and yellowed with age. I found his old email archives, searching the name Gregory. The results were swift and devastatingly clear. Gregory was David's primary research partner, a fellow engineering student who shared his boundless, reckless enthusiasm for the geothermal project. They had been inseparable, fueled by endless cups of cheap coffee and the feverish belief in their source. The email trail showed a rapid, frantic communication between them, full of technical jargon, excitement, and a growing sense of paranoia in the final few weeks. David's emails became terse. Gregory's grew urgent. Then an abrupt break. The final email from Gregory, dated just 2 days after David's panic scribbling in the notebook, was a cold, formal announcement to David's personal address. Family reasons necessitate an immediate and indefinite cessation of all communication and work. Do not try to contact me. It was a lie. A manufactured curtain drawn over a sudden, forced withdrawal. A 7-year silence had begun not with grief, but with that single sterile fabrication. The votive, the car, the hurried return. It was almost certainly Gregory, finally reaching out after 7 years of silent exile. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been intercepted simultaneously with David. The powerful entity that took David had also managed to neutralize his partner, isolating them both. The paper crane wasn't a warning. It was a lifeline. A desperate act of contact made possible only after the threat had momentarily receded. Gregory was operating under the same fear that had consumed David in his final hours. I leaned back, resting my head against the cold wood of the wall. The emotional reality was immense. Gregory hadn't abandoned David. He had been forced to disappear, to cut all ties, likely under duress or the threat of the same fate that befell David. The 7 years were not a choice. They were a sentence of imposed silence. What was the nature of that coercion? What could force a young man to abandon his passion, his closest friend, and his entire life, only to reappear 7 years later, communicating solely through guarded, cryptic actions like a coded votive and a paper crane? The answer lay in the extreme caution. Gregory was terrified of the research facility's power. They hadn't just stolen the technology. They had successfully instilled a long-term, debilitating fear in anyone associated with it. Gregory was still operating under the shadow of the threat, forced to communicate in a way that left no physical or digital trace that could be traced back to him. The candle was lit in the dark because the light itself was dangerous. The crane was folded from old graph paper because new stationery could be tracked. The knowledge was the poison. The geothermal power source was valuable enough to shatter 2 lives and instill a decade of terror. The circular mark on the crane now felt like a desperate plea for technical collaboration, a quiet request for the specialized knowledge I had seen detailed in David's final notebook entries. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, extinguishing the digital ghosts. The physical evidence, the well, the notebook, the crane, was now unified under the name Gregory. I had the collaborator's name and the key to the well, the brass key. The paper crane, the symbol of hope, was now my direct, unspoken contract with Gregory. I had to assume he was close, waiting for my next move, waiting for me to acknowledge his lifeline. I looked at David's notebook, specifically at the rough sketches detailing the structure of the iron rings in the well. The circular mark on the crane must refer to a tool needed for the iron ring. The silence around David was not cold indifference. It was the chilling, calculated pressure of a large, powerful entity covering its tracks. And now, Gregory was asking me to break that silence with an act of courage. I folded the paper crane and tucked it into the last, blank page of David's notebook. It was time to return to the dry basin, this time with the collaborator waiting in the shadows. This chapter is the direct communication and essential exposition, finally confirming the well's function and the identity of the threat. I will focus on the tension of the phone call, the technical reveal, and the chilling difference between David's and Gregory's fates, all delivered in the reflective, cinematic style. The decision felt reckless, the opposite of the contained life I had meticulously built. But the name Gregory, scrawled on the paper crane, had become an anchor of necessary risk. I returned to the well, the afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to watch me. I placed a single small piece of paper on the mossy stone curb. The message was stark, clear, and terrifyingly exposed. Call me. Gregory. 555. XXXXXX. I secured the note under a smooth, heavy river stone. It was an open invitation into the darkness, a public declaration that the silence was over. I then retreated to the house, drawing the curtains, waiting for the night to fall and the inevitable consequence of my exposure. The weight was immense. Every passing hour felt like a minute, every sound a prelude to the ringing. I sat in the darkened living room, the house silent and expectant. The fear was a cold, constant pressure, but underneath it was the burning heat of determination. I was no longer the grieving sister. I was David's final collaborator. The phone rang precisely at midnight. The sound was deafening in the silence. The number was blocked. I picked up instantly. Hello. My voice was low, steady, a carefully constructed barrier against the fear. There was a long silence on the other end, just the sound of distant, static breath. Anna. It was a man's voice, quiet, strained, and tight with residual fear. It was Gregory. It's me, Gregory, he confirmed, his voice barely a whisper, as if he expected the walls to listen. You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have put your number out there. You left a candle and a paper crane, I countered, my voice firm. You wanted to be found, Gregory. Now tell me what David found. He paused, the silence filled with the static hum of the long distance and the immense weight of the years. The well, Anna. The well is not just a well. It's the capped ventilation shaft. He confirmed the technical urgency. David, using his geological maps and engineering skills, had realized the old well was perfectly positioned. It wasn't drilled for water. It was the vertical opening for a system he had secretly installed beneath the yard, designed to prove his geothermal energy theory. The old man who owned the land before you, he let David work there for free, Gregory explained, his voice gaining a strained urgency. David found the vein. He tapped the heat source. The well's dry mouth was the perfect access and exhaust point. The technical reality was breathtaking and terrifying. My childhood garden, my quiet home, rested on top of a revolutionary untapped power source. Who are they? I asked. The people who sent the agent, the research facility. Gregory's voice cracked. They're not just a research facility, Anna. They're an acquisition shell for a massive energy conglomerate. They track every patent, every viable technology. David's theory wasn't delusional. It was billion-dollar reality. He built a working prototype under your house. He explained that local, powerful moneyed interests, the ones who ran the regional energy grids, got wind of David's success through a leak at the patent office. They didn't want the technology, they wanted the silence. A self-sustaining energy source would obliterate their entire infrastructure. They needed David's knowledge, Anna, Gregory whispered. They needed the shutdown codes and the final schematics before they sealed the well and buried the truth. The realization was a punch to the gut. They hadn't wanted to kill David. They needed to silence him and take his work. But you escaped, I pressed, the question heavy with years of unspoken pity. Why did they only silence David? Why did they let you go? Gregory let out a quiet, painful laugh. Because I was never the engineer, Anna. I was just the help, the technician. I could build it, but only David could conceptualize it. I only had the final schematics, not the core theory. They believed their primary target, the brain, was neutralized. He escaped because he was deemed unimportant. The realization was chilling. David was silenced because he was the genius. Gregory was allowed to live in hiding because his knowledge was considered incomplete and therefore not a threat. I managed to get out that night after I saw what they did, Gregory confessed, his voice thick with unspent grief. I couldn't help him, but I promised David's memory that I would keep the light on until it was safe to speak. The candle, it was a message to David's spirit, and a silent promise to his truth. The vigil, the paper crane, the 7 years of silence, it was all an act of quiet, terrifying loyalty. They are back because you went to Vance, Gregory warned, his voice urgent now. They know the system is still there. They're looking for the access panel and the shutdown key. I looked at the brass key I had found in the well, the key I believed was meant for the iron ring. It was the key to David's truth. Where are you? I asked. Close enough to watch, he said, the voice tight again. I can't risk meeting. But I can guide you. You have to go back to the well, Anna. Find the panel. Find the key he hid. They will be moving fast now. Then a sudden rush of static, a loud click, and the line went dead. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with grief. It was sharp, clear, and dangerous. The truth of David's final hours was laid bare. I had to go back to the dry basin, find the panel, and finish the work my brother died protecting. This chapter is the physical and technical climax, where the mystery is made concrete. I will focus on the tension of the covert meeting, the technical details of the iron rings, and the final chilling question of the well's function as either a shield or a trap, all delivered in the required reflective cinematic style. I met him at midnight. The moon was thin, hidden behind a veil of high cloud, leaving the world steeped in a profound, inky darkness. I carried a strong flashlight, but I kept the beam low, cutting a small cone of light into the wet grass. The phone call had been tense. The meeting felt inevitable. Gregory was waiting in the deep shadow of the large oak tree near the perimeter fence. He moved like a shadow himself, quick, silent, and dressed in dark, nondescript clothing. He looked older, gaunter than the photo in David's yearbook, his eyes large and haunted. The years of silence had taken a heavy toll. Anna, he murmured, his voice tight, the sound carrying only a few feet in the damp air. He didn't offer a greeting, only confirmed the urgent reality of the moment. There was no time for shared grief or reunion. The well was the subject. We walked the short distance to the stone circle, the air cold and thick with the scent of damp earth. I had already removed the heavy slate cap, leaving the dark, empty mouth of the shaft exposed. They'll be watching the roads, Gregory whispered, his head constantly swiveling. We have maybe 20 minutes before the risk becomes unacceptable. He descended into the well first, agile and practiced, using the rope I had secured days ago. I followed him down into the cold, subterranean darkness, the small circle of light from my lamp barely cutting through the thick air. We stood together at the base of the dry basin, surrounded by the smell of mineral and rust. The candle, Gregory began, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. It was never for remembrance, Anna. Not in the beginning. It was a subtle marker. He explained that the votive was a signal for his own small, trusted network. a way to confirm that the shaft remained sealed and untouched by the corporate security team. A small, flickering light was meant to indicate status quo to someone watching from a distance, without drawing official attention. He had risked the personal connection only after confirming the corporate agent's initial visit. David and I knew the risk, Gregory explained, his light tracing the rough stone walls. The well's original purpose was to conceal a small access point. The cap was our alibi. The shaft was the shield. He directed my flashlight beam to the nearest iron ring, the one riddled with the scratches David had made. These iron rings, he continued, tapping the rusted metal, they are not part of the well's structure. They are the frame for the cap sealing off the installation. The whole shaft is essentially a man-sized keyway. Gregory showed me how the heavy rings were anchored not to the stone, but to a separate cylindrical liner sunk deeper into the earth. The surface stones were simply a camouflage. The deep scratches around the bottom ring confirmed David's struggle to access a hidden latch or pivot. The source is beneath us, Gregory whispered, his voice intense. The heat collector and the prototype generator are housed in a chamber just below this basin. The bottom iron ring, it's the lock mechanism. It releases the pressure plate into the chamber. He pulled the tarnished brass key from my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. He inserted the key into a hidden slot on the iron ring, a niche concealed by years of rust and carefully disguised as a flaw in the casting. The key slid in a perfect, quiet fit. The silence in the well seemed to contract. The cap, the structure around us, was the final barrier David built to save his work, Gregory stated. He had to activate the lock and seal the shaft quickly. He confessed that he didn't know David's exact fate. He had seen the corporate agents move in on the house that night, but he was too far away to intervene. He believed that David, trapped with no escape, managed to hide the project's critical data, the final schematics, the shutdown sequence, before vanishing. He wouldn't have left the data on the surface. It had to be secured, Gregory said, looking down at the packed earth floor of the basin. He used the one place they wouldn't easily risk disrupting, the heart of the system itself. Gregory didn't turn the key. The answer to the mystery lay just beyond that brass key. Was the well cap the barrier David used to save his work, securing the data and the prototype just as his pursuers arrived? Or, in the terrifying, chaotic final moments, did the well cap become the trap, the one-way door that the corporate agents sealed after forcing David to reveal his secrets? The silence of the well offered no comfort. The rough stone, the rusted iron, the small scratches, they all bore witness to the final desperate minutes of David's life. He either sealed the lock from the outside or he sealed it from the inside. Gregory looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading in the narrow beam of the flashlight. If we turn this key, Anna, we will find out if he succeeded in hiding the data, or if he was forced to hide himself. I reached out and placed my hand over Gregory's, steadying his tremor. The brass key was cool beneath my glove. The decision to turn it was a decision to face the final, immediate consequence of David's work. The silence of the well was a ticking clock. We turn it, I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. David didn't risk 7 years of silence and your life for a grave. He sealed a treasure. The small rusted iron ring, the heart of the lock, was waiting. The true depth of David's final act was about to be revealed. The past was no longer a shadow. It was a physical barrier that we were about to break. This final chapter provides the resolution to the technical mystery and focuses entirely on Anna's emotional and moral inheritance. I will concentrate on the sensory details of the final action, the symbolic lighting of the candle, and the reflective conclusion regarding Anna's future choices, maintaining the necessary cinematic and reflective tone. The air in the well shaft was thick with anticipation. My hand was still resting on Gregory's, confirming the decision. He took the brass key, his movements sharp and focused. The key turned with a dull, heavy thunk, the sound echoing once in the confined stone space. It was the sound of a very old, very strong lock being released. Gregory didn't pause. He worked quickly, using specialized tools he had hidden in his jacket, thin steel probes and a compact ratchet, to disengage the lock mechanism. He located the hidden seams in the mortar around the lowest iron ring, and pried the metal frame away from the stone lining. The entire section of the shaft floor, the final packed earth basin, was revealed to be a circular pressure plate. With a small, controlled hiss of displaced air, the plate lifted a few inches, revealing a hollow space beneath. Gregory immediately directed the flashlight beam into the space. The air that escaped was warmer, drier, and smelled faintly of copper and ionized air. The distinct scent of David's technical world. It was a small, sealed compartment, built right into the concrete foundation that held the geothermal heat exchanger beneath. It was designed for one purpose: final storage. Inside, nestled securely, was a single object. A small, dark, waterproof drive. It was unremarkable, easily overlooked, but its existence was the entire answer to the 7-year silence. Gregory reached in and retrieved it, holding the small drive up to the light. It was cold, solid, and utterly silent. David's encrypted data. The full schematics, the shutdown codes, the final undeniable proof of his self-sustaining energy source. He succeeded, Gregory whispered, the fear finally receding from his voice, replaced by a deep, weary triumph. He sealed the access point from the outside, Anna. He locked the data down here, then ran. He bought time. David had not been trapped in the well. He had used the well as a shield, ensuring that even if the corporate agents captured him and forced him to reveal the location of the source, the critical data, the key to building and controlling the technology, would remain safe. He had chosen the immense pain of vanishing over the immediate surrender of his work. Gregory's face, illuminated by the dim light of the flashlight, was etched with relief and a renewed, profound purpose. The source is safe, he repeated. And with this drive, his mission is safe. They silenced the messenger, but they didn't get the message. He secured the compartment, carefully replacing the iron frame and setting the pressure plate back into the dry basin, the mechanism clicking back into a final, quiet lock. The secret was buried again, but this time intentionally securely. We climbed out of the well shaft, emerging back into the cool, silent air of the garden. The sudden lightness of the world was palpable. Gregory stood by the stone curb, holding the small drive in his hand, a tiny, massive weight. "I have to leave now, Anna," he said, his voice firm. "I have contacts, people who understand the political risk. I will use David's data. I will honor his mission. The truth will come out, not in a whisper, but in a wave of power they can't stop." He turned to leave, vanishing quickly into the morning shadows, taking the encrypted drive, David's entire life's work, with him. I stood alone by the well. The open shaft was still exposed, a black circle on the green lawn. I carefully replaced the heavy slate cap, pushing it back into place with a slow, grinding effort. The well was silent once more, closed off from the world. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the single, unused votive candle I had brought down days ago. I found a lighter and carefully struck the flint. A small, clean flame sputtered to life. I placed the third, final candle directly over the sealed-off access point, exactly where Gregory had demonstrated the lock was hidden. It was no longer a vigil for a lost brother. It was not a warning. It was a beacon for his future discovery. The flame was small and frail, yet impossibly bright against the cold stone. I watched it flicker, finally understanding the profound, dangerous weight of the inherited secret. How will Anna carry this weight? The burden of witness. Anna's life is now the final barrier between David's truth and the corporate interests. She cannot speak. She must live a life of calculated silence, mirroring Gregory's 7-year exile. Her quiet control, once a defense against grief, must now become a defense against corporate violence. She must become the perfect picture of placid, solved grief, ensuring no one ever suspects the source remains active. The lie of peace. She will continue to live in Havenwood, but her home is no longer a haven. It is the cradle of a revolution. She must maintain the lie of peace, keeping the house clean, the lawn cut, the sorrow contained, knowing the ground beneath her feet holds a multi-billion-dollar secret and the final answer to David's fate. She is a sentinel, waiting for the inevitable day when the power company returns to look for what Gregory now holds. The unlit future. Her future is no longer about finding closure, but about preserving opportunity. She will not seek justice through confrontation. Her mission is to live so quietly, so predictably, that the corporate world believes the case is closed, allowing Gregory the time and space needed to deploy David's technology. She is preserving the light, even though she can't watch it burn. Her love for David is transformed into a political shield. I stood watching the small, resolute flame. The mystery was solved, but the danger was just beginning. The silent, peaceful life I sought was impossible now. I had inherited David's legacy, and I would honor it one quiet, watchful day at a time. The flame flickered, a small, bright promise in the large, dark world. Did you enjoy the story? And from which city are you listening? Tell me in the comments. I always love hearing from you. If this story touched your heart, you can support me with a super thanks. Your support helps me continue creating more stories for you. 2 more beautiful life stories are on your screen right now. I hope you enjoy them too. There's so much more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.